Good afternoon, everyone. It's Graham Campbell here, Chair of the ENA Data Working Group. Welcome to this afternoon's public webinar. Before I go on, can I just check that I can be heard okay? Maybe just raise a hand or... Perfect, great, thank you. Okay, so welcome to today's webinar, hosted by myself and supported by Randolph at the ENA. I'm delighted to host today's webinar, delighted to see so many attendees join us. We've over 75 on the webinar at the moment, and I expect that to increase over the next few minutes. But I do suggest we move on as we have a full agenda today. Could you move on a slide, please, Vivian, if you don't mind? So, as I said, we have a large number of attendees today, so we would appreciate it, please, if you could stay on mute for the whole meeting. If you're having any technical difficulties, if you're struggling to hear or join the webinar, then please do contact Vivian, Lena or Randolph, who will provide assistance to you. We've been through this with those presenting today, but just as a reminder for presenters, all slides are being controlled centrally. So if you do need to move on a slide, then please just say next slide. For yourselves as delegates and the audience, we will have 2 question and answer sessions today. The first, after about half an hour or so, after we've given an introduction, and Gabby's provided an update on the digitalisation strategies. And we will have a further stakeholder session after the specific data working group updates. We'll be using Slido for that. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, will have used Slido before and are familiar with how it works. The details, if you aren't, are on the slide, www.slido.com or www.slide.do. And the event code, which is case sensitive, is DWG. The housekeeping is pretty simple. Please do interact. That's the point of this today. We are looking for feedback. We are looking for you to ask questions. We are looking for you to challenge and comment on the activities that we are undertaking as a data working group, and look forward to a very interactive session. Vivian, would you move on? Please, thank you. So by way of agenda, we have a welcome, which I'm providing in a minute. We have an introduction to the ENA and the data working group itself. We will then move on quickly to an introduction to the digitalisation strategies published by each of the network companies, and then we will have a quick 10-minute question and answer session. Thereafter, we will get into the purpose of today's webinar, which is to give the audience an update on 2 specific activities that the data working group are progressing with. The first is on data triage, and the second is on data system mapping, which I will introduce the presenters to you prior to each session. We will then have a 20 or 25 minute or so stakeholder session where we will use the Slido function to answer questions, perhaps 1 or 2 polls to test where the audience believe we are in terms of the digitalisation journey that we're on, before concluding just before 2:30 this afternoon. So, as I said, delighted to host today's workshop. It's a privilege to chair the data working group. We've been together now for 9 months or so, and I think we're making excellent progress in what is a really progressive environment, and I look forward to a very useful and constructive webinar today. So thank you all for joining. So if we move on, Vivian, please. So at this juncture, I'll pass over to Randolph, who's the Head of Innovation and Development at the ENA, who will provide an introduction to itself and digitalisation in general. Thank you, Randolph.
Thanks, Graham, and good afternoon. I hope you're well. I'm going to give you guys a brief introduction to ENA for those of you who don't know us, and also what we're doing with digitalisation. So if we just move on, thank you very much. So ENA represents the gas and electricity networks in the UK and Ireland at transmission and distribution. And all of the data work that we're undertaking at ENA and digitalisation work covers our full membership. So it's all of the members that you see on the screen there. In yellow in the bottom left, you've got the gas members. And then up in the top right in red, you've got the electricity members, and you can see the split there between distribution and transmission. We're very much taking a whole systems approach to this work. Next slide, please. So we believe that digitalisation is at the centre of the energy system, and it's critical for unlocking consumer benefits and helping to achieve our net zero targets. This is a key focus for us, and all of our members, so all of the companies that you saw on the previous screen, we fully support this work and the recommendations that came out of the Energy Data Taskforce. The Energy Data Taskforce, or EDTF as it's sometimes known, was launched a couple of years ago, and the report was released last year. And when I was writing this slide, I was trying to figure out a suitable word to describe it, but I ended up landing on revolutionary. And I think that's fair, because it really has ensured that digitalisation and data is right at the top of the energy transition agenda, both within ENA, but also I think it's fair to say from an industry-wide perspective. So you've got quite a few of the people who were involved in that on the line today and in the audience as well. So I do again congratulate everyone for that fantastic piece of work. So as most of you are probably aware, there were 5 key recommendations from the EDTF, which are on the screen there. And today in particular, we're going to be focusing on recommendation 2. And the principle that energy system data should be presumed open. So you'll be seeing some of the work that we're doing to help deliver that recommendation, and what we're doing from a data triage perspective. What we're also going to be doing going forward is focusing other webinars and stakeholder engagement sessions on some of the other recommendations. So some of you may have seen our work on recommendation 5 previously with our digital systems map. There'll be a brief update on that today. We'll also focus some of the other sessions on the recommendations, as well as the guidance that was provided in the best practice document for data that was developed by the Energy Systems Catapult. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to show you guys how we think of data and the work we're doing in the context of the wider ENA program. So at ENA, we've got 2 key future networks projects. So looking towards future strategy for networks. On the electricity side, on the left there, you've got the Open Networks project, which is looking at the rolling out smart grids, transitioning our DNOs to DSOs, looking at flexibility markets. And then on the right-hand side there, you've got the Gas Goes Green project, which is looking at decarbonising the gas networks and transitioning from methane to hydrogen and other green gases. So these 2 key projects are looking at the future of networks. And what we identified, especially after the EDTF came out, was that data is absolutely key to enabling the future of the networks. So what we did, which you'll hear about from Graham in a minute, is set up something called our Data Working Group, which is looking at essentially digitalising our networks on the gas and electricity side. And we're very much aligning these 2 projects via that working group. And you'll also notice that the stakeholder engagement that we're doing under our data work is happening via those 2 projects. So we don't have a separate stakeholder engagement mechanism for the data working group. We're very much going via those 2 future networks projects. So that's how this work is aligning to our wider innovation and future networks work at ENA. I'm now going to hand back to Graham, who's going to talk to you more about what the data working group does at ENA. Thanks, Graham.
Okay, Randolph, thank you. So as I said right at the outset, I am the chair of the data working group and very privileged to be so. At Ranch, or back at the Ranch, I'm actually the head of distribution system operations and whole systems at SP Energy Networks, of which, of course, digitalisation and data form a key part. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes very quickly on what we are as a data working group. So we recognised at the outset from the recommendations of the Energy Data Taskforce that there was a gap. Data was being picked up tactically by the various different forums that Randolph outlined, but wasn't necessarily looking at data strategically. And it was important that we brought together the network companies across electricity and gas to form that data working group in response to the recommendations of the Energy Data Taskforce. That group that I'd share is working very closely with BEIS, Ofgem, Innovate UK and others. And we also provide an advisory or a seat on the advisory group for what was the Modernising Energy Data Access competition run by Innovate UK. All network companies have publicised digitalisation strategies. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have seen one or more of those strategies and read through them in detail. And the Data Working Group, crucially, is supporting the delivery of those Energy Data Taskforce report recommendations, and in many respects have subgroups aligned to each of those recommendations. Today, our webinar will focus principally on the data triage and digital systems map work streams. Okay, Vivian? So importantly, and as I implied only a minute or so ago, the data working group is there to try and provide that coordination across the ENA and industry. And there are countless initiatives ongoing in relation to digitalisation and data. And we are trying, where possible, to make sure that those are coordinated, delivered effectively, and interacting with each other in a way that brings benefit to consumers and achieves the outputs that we're seeking. Whether it's distributed energy resource registers, whether it's the NUAR or the National Underground Asset Register, regulatory reporting data for Ofgem, or even flexibility market. There are, as I say, countless, but that coordination is critical to ensure we make the best outcome available for customers. And as a data working group, what we are trying to do is be quite agile in how we go about doing that. We are trying to form quick, responsive actions and make tangible progress such that we can demonstrate to you, our stakeholders, i.e. the users of the system, that we are making progress and we're serious about this in light of the things we've talked about. Okay, Vivian. So stakeholder engagement is crucial to that. We do not wish to work in isolation, nor do we intend to. We need you to feed back to us in terms of what we're doing, the quality of that. Is it achieving what you need? Is it working with you? Is it looking at the activities and issues that you face? And how can you get involved in the work that we are doing? This is the second webinar we're doing, and we're looking to run a series of webinars based on the recommendation Energy Data Taskforce and the best practice guide that's been developed, and I'm sure you're very familiar with. We have a web page through the ENA, and the hyperlink is there on the slide at the ENA website. But we should also ask you, and it's important that we do so, what other tools or forums could we use? So there's obviously the open networks and Gasco's green mailing lists. There are stakeholder engagement sessions that are organised from time to time, and clearly that's been made somewhat more challenging given the context of the environment we're working in at the moment. But there are many other public events, and there are equally individual network company stakeholder engagement events, but are there others? Are there other things that we should consider? So we'll look for some feedback from you today on what else we might do to ensure that the work that we're doing, the objectives that we're seeking to achieve, are well known and are aligning with what it is you're trying to do. Okay, Vivian. So on that, and I'm conscious that we're maybe running a couple of minutes behind, I will pass over to Gabby Barnard, who is Head of Information Management at Scotia Gas Networks, who will introduce the concept of digitalisation strategies and what it means in the work that we're doing for the Data Working Group. Okay, Gabby, thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Hello, everybody. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So what I'm going to do is reintroduce the digitalisation strategies, provide you with a bit of an overview again of digitalisation. Last year, all of the networks published their first digitalisation strategies as requested by Ofgem. And I'm not going to go into the detail of each of these. They have been published on the Ofgem website and also by each of the network companies themselves. But what I'd like to do is touch on what is digitalisation, what does it mean, and how do we believe it can help to deliver some of the key challenges we have in energy around net zero, but also customer focus outcomes as well. What I was also going to do was talk about some of the measures that are being proposed for RIIO2, which is our next regulatory price control period, along with some of the initial feedback that we've received from Ofgem to date. But as Graham has said, we would also like to invite your feedback. We will be looking to publish version 2 of our digitalisation strategies in December, and we do very much want to incorporate your views in terms of what those next steps need to look like. Next slide, please. So one of the building blocks of the EDTF report, as I've mentioned, Ofgem did request that we start with publishing our own digitalisation strategies. So what is digitalisation? There's a statement here around it being able to release value, opportunity and resilience to enable decarbonisation and decentralisation at optimal cost for our consumers. Digitalisation isn't just about automating business processes. It reaches further into organisations and indeed across the whole energy network and beyond. And it's about joining up those key processes, systems, and critically the data that flows throughout them that informs what we do, what we have done, and also what might happen. And it's about incorporating smart data technologies and solutions such as analytics, artificial intelligence and machine learning. And it's about connecting people, connecting infrastructure, connecting energy through an organisation and beyond, and providing those timely insights as to what has happened, is happening and may happen in the future. And this combined delivers better informed decisions for us all, but also enables greater efficiencies to be realised and those innovative solutions that our customers are calling for. So this is something that we're already doing, both with our internal processes and within each network company, but also collaboratively. And this is something that we've called out in our strategies. Next slide, please, Vivian. So this next slide just gives a snapshot of what we're talking about. Our industry is rising to the challenge of delivering net zero carbon efficiency and also customer focused services and solutions. And this is talking around things like whole energy system approach, distributed energy, greening gas solutions, and also connecting and informing our customers, but also our workforce as well. And this relies on having the right data flowing through our organisations, but also across the energy sector as a whole and even beyond. And as Graham alluded to, data really is at the heart of this, but it's also making sure that that data is available in a timely and seamless fashion. And this will underpin the energy sector and those organisations directly and indirectly associated with it to collaborate and innovate. And that's going to be key to us achieving and delivering those challenges. So we all recognise that whilst we're making great progress, this is a hugely significant transformational journey across the energy sector. Next slide, please. So in the lead up to RIIO2, which for the gas networks begins in April next year, April 2021, and the electricity networks in April 2023, Ofgem published an open letter. This was back in June this year, and it provided some initial feedback to us on the digitalisation strategies, along with their proposals for regulatory measures to start to enshrine these recommendations that have come out of the Energy Data Taskforce report. So effectively what they've said is that there is really good alignment with the EDTF recommendations that have been demonstrated through the digitalisation strategies. What they've also commented on is that overall the energy sector is behind other economic contributors, but they do recognise that commitment is being demonstrated, and I think that's quite important. They're looking for continued and demonstrable progress through greater collaboration and coordination, which is something that we have taken on board, and this is across the wider energy sector. There will be further and more detailed feedback sessions lined up for next week, which we will be attending, and obviously taking on board Ofgem's recommendations to it. But we'd like to also take this opportunity today to get your feedback and have set up some questions, as I think we've mentioned before. Next slide, please. So to further enshrine digitalisation and data, Ofgem are proposing the implementation of the following licence obligations. The first one is around the regular publication of digitalisation strategies. So our next one is due in December this year, and as it states here, there will be an expectation that we will repeat that once every 2 years. But as an interim, they're also looking for an action plan from us to demonstrate that continual and ongoing delivery of digitalisation solutions. The next one really talks about one of the key recommendations, which is about maximising the value of data, and it's about that adoption of data best practice guidelines, and in particular the principle of data being presumed open, and that's quite key again in terms of that engagement, that collaboration and development of innovative solutions going forward. Next slide, please. So that's really it in terms of where we are with the digitalisation strategies and what's been happening, what the plans, the emerging plans are for RIIO-2. I don't know if there's going to be any questions, Slido questions or questions coming out from that.
Okay, Gabby, thank you. And hopefully that's given the audience some detail and context around digitalisation strategies and what that means for the industry. So we're now in a short Q&A session, having heard the introduction to the ENA, the Data Working Group, and Gabby's very useful presentation on digitalisation strategies. We do have one question now on Slido, which will ask Gabby to answer, if you don't mind. It was hinted at in your slide, but questions come in from an anonymous attendee, which says, how often will the digitalisation strategies be published?
So sorry if I didn't clarify that. So version 2, if you like, will be published December this year. And subject to further consultation with Ofgem, the current proposal is that they will be published at least every 2 years after that.
Okay, Gabby, thank you, and hopefully that will answer the question asked. Please do use Slido. We do have a poll open at the moment, which we would really appreciate your thoughts and feedback on. The live poll is, what benefits do you think the digitalisation of networks can bring about for customers? So we're really looking for as many responses and thoughts to this as possible. This will help us inform the work and the activities we are undertaking as a data working group, but will also prompt questions from within the audience. So please don't be shy, ask away. We are here today to respond to your questions. So please ask any questions that you think are necessary. So there's another question come in on Slido. Perhaps for yourself, Randolph, if you don't mind, is how are you collaborating with the MEDA project?
Thanks, Graham. Yeah, Good question. So we're collaborating on a couple of fronts. So from a data working group perspective, we've met with the competition winners, learned about what they're doing and input that way. And we will also be collaborating with the winners that get through to the next stage of the project. And also we are going to be sitting on the steering group for the project. So that will involve reviewing the proposals by the winners, but also providing them with data sets that they can use in the development of their work as part of the project.
Okay, Randolph, thanks. And just a quick one for yourself too. Someone has asked, will we be sharing the webinar, will the webinar be recorded and shared following the session and the slides too?
Yeah, so in short, yes. So we're recording the webinar. We're going to publish it on ENA's YouTube channel. We will also follow up probably within the week with the slides and also any questions that we weren't able to answer as a part of the webinar today.
Okay, great, Randolph, thank you. And there's one further question come in, which I maybe point to either yourself, Steve, and it's maybe Steve initially and Matt thereafter, which is, is there any progress with producing data catalogues that was proposed by the EDTF?
When we come to talk about the triage process, we'll be starting to talk a little bit about metadata, and I think that probably is an enabler that we need to start thinking about building up a data catalog. So we need to understand how to describe the data sets. So from a data triage perspective, I think that metadata is quite key. And I know Matt will have some comments to say about the proposals for the digital system map and the data sets and data catalog that might be upcoming from that.
Okay, Steve, thank you. Matt, any comments from yourself on the data catalog question?
No, not a huge amount to add to what Steve said there. As he touched upon the development of the digital system map, a key enabling deliverable there is the data catalog, the specification of the data requirements associated with each business case, the triage activity that flows off the back of that, and in turn the ability for each network operator to fill those. So certainly that is a key foundational element and a key enabler for many parts of a lot of the deliverables that we're going to have across the EDTF recommendations that will come off the back of those various initiatives.
Okay, thank you for those comments. There is actually a further question come in that I'll point to yourself, Matt and Steve, again, if you don't mind. That is, to get real-time data, will data be uploaded to application programming interfaces, or APIs as they're commonly known, and any further details on that?
So I'll start off with that one if I can. From a triage subgroup perspective, we've not really looked at the delivery platform, the endpoint for how data will be pushed out, but I think the EDTF report is clear in that its recommendations is looking for interoperability of data sets, and that really does require APIs, I would say. So I think it's kind of a given that we will need to be moving towards a mechanism to provide data via APIs. The actual delivery platform for that is being looked at through separate initiatives for the metadata. Meta competition winners, for example, they're looking at that area at the moment. So the digital system map also being an area where we'll be looking to expose geospatial based data and information, and part of that, Matt, apologies, I'm probably stealing some of your thunder here, but part of that will be the ability to link into that and electronically collect and electronically using APIs.
Yeah, absolutely. So I agree with Steve. APIs are absolutely going to be part of that future landscape and facilitating that data access and interoperability. Microservices, no doubt, will also be part of that picture. The reality is that we have the EDTF recommendations. We have a range of enabling activities that we need to complete as MG network operators in terms of surfacing that data, ensuring it's in the right standards formats. We have the metadata, all these different components that we've been talking about. In terms of how we surface that, make it available, will be varied. And what we need to be able to do is standardize and make things as consistent as possible across the piece. Then we have a number of vehicles available to us to serve as many different use cases, consumption options, and stakeholders as possible. So it's a little bit further down the road in terms of the actual application of APIs and platforms and so on, but certainly it's all part of that picture and strategy.
Okay, Steve, Matt, thank you for that. We have a couple of further questions. I'm conscious that time is moving on. So one of them, which references the balance between existing data and surfacing new data, will leave to the stakeholder section at the end, if you don't mind, to the individual that asked that question. But I will just ask Gabby one, if you don't mind, which is, do you have a target date for the publication of action plans, which I suspect relates to the digitalisation strategy? It might not, but for the purpose of this question, if you don't mind relating it to that, that would be useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Yes, the action plans do relate to the digitalisation strategy, and there is consultation going on at the moment, so I can't say for sure exactly when the first one will be published or what the format will be, and that's in discussion with Ofgem currently. But the licence obligations, certainly as far as the gas networks are concerned, will come into being for DD2, which is as from the 1st of April next year. And the information currently that I have is that there is an expectation that they will be published once every 6 months at least. But I don't have any further information on how that mechanism is going to work at this point in time.
Okay, Gabby, thank you. And yeah, so I should also have said right at the outset, I do apologise, that we will publish responses to all the questions that have been asked. So perhaps we have picked up the intention of the question incorrectly during this session, nor indeed potentially answered it in the manner in which you may well have liked. So we will be responding to each of the questions at a later date. So hopefully that will be useful too, and they'll clearly be published. So on that, there are one or two other questions being asked, which we will pick up on at the end. I suggest we move on to the meat, if so to speak, of today's webinar. So if you could move on a slide, please, Vivian. So the first section, if you like, that we're going to cover off, and it will be Steve who does this, which you have already heard from in terms of one of the two of the questions, is data triage. Now, Steve is a colleague of mine at SP Energy Networks, and he is the IT lead for DSO, but a very integral part, as all of us are, to the data working group. So Steve, if you mind, please give your slides on data triage.
Okay, thank you. Vivian, could you move on a slide for me, please? Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Pleased to be presenting here, and again, please fire up questions and interact, because that's kind of a key thing for this. I want to spend most of today going through a process we've been working on within the data triage subgroup of the data working group around how we would handle a request for data. But just before I do that, I'll just do a bit of scene settings around what the data triage group is covering. So the kind of things we're looking at is to create a standard approach for dealing with requests for data. And we've talked about things like having service level agreements, so having a mechanism to ensure that we respond in an appropriate manner in an appropriate amount of time. We've invented a new acronym, a GUIAD we called it, for Give Us All Your Data, and that's the kind of thing which we as network companies do sometimes see. So we've been trying to think about how do we help engage with data requesters and target and focus discussion to get more to the underlying requirement and make that a bit clearer for everybody and move more efficiently through the process. We've been talking about how we monitor and track activity in this area, so understanding how many requests we're receiving and who's sending the requests in, and what data is being utilized and what isn't being used as well. And we've also talked about having a reactive versus a proactive approach. So A lot of what I'm going to talk about here is the reactive side of things. So what happens when we receive a request for some data, but it could be turned on its head, and we could say that it applies equally to taking a proactive approach to sharing data. So we ourselves as network companies could be the data user, the data requester, and we should be looking at our data sets and working out how to push them through a triage process and make them as open as possible in accordance with the presumed open principles and the Energy Data Taskforce recommendations. Stakeholder engagement is a key part of what we've looked at as well. So how do we not only engage with the people who are going to request the data, but also look at our activity in the context of other things that are happening within the wider space. We're keen to get started on this soon. So we've talked about a minimum viable product and what that would look like, and developing a mechanism to facilitate continuous improvement and get something started and then move on from that relatively quickly. And we've recognized that there is a need for a data triage governance group, somebody that's an organization or set of organizations that sit above this and allow us to communicate and coordinate across the relevant different groups and deal with any conflict or escalations that might happen in the process. So that's the kind of context that we're working within. And next few slides, I want to talk about a high-level process for dealing with a request for data. So if you could move on a slide, please. Thank you, Vivian. So the diagram on the left of here, you may not be able to read all of that. I'm going to explode parts of it as I go through the presentation, so don't worry about having to read all of that just now. The key point of it is that there's kind of three vertical bars in there of activities. There's the request handling process, what happens when a request is first identified and how does that go through an initial process. There's the triage activity, and then there's the sort of publish and maintain and overall governance at the right hand side. So in fact, although we're called a data triage subgroup, one thing we have recognized is that the triage is actually the responsibility of each data custodian in the EDTF terminology. Each network organization has got its own approach to risk management and has its own responsibilities for GDPR compliance or security, privacy. Those kind of things all need to be dealt with by the individual organizations. So we are not going to develop a triage, define a triage process that all of the network companies adhere to. What we're going to do, though, is to look at creating a kind of common entry and exit point into the triage process. So that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about today. The way we've talked about that, if we could move on a slide, please, Vivian, is on the entry side of things that we think it's pretty key to define the data requirement up front, and we've decided that the sensible way of doing that will be to develop the metadata description of the data. And interestingly, this falls back to some of the questions that I've noticed have been asked via Slido around the taxonomy, and that we need to get that done first, and that's been one of our findings from this, that we need to get that metadata standard defined and agreed so that we're all on the same page basically when we talk about a request. We have had some conversations with the Energy Systems Catapult about the Dublin Core metadata standard, and that's the recommendation that's in the guidance. The recognition, I think, is that that's probably not sufficient for what we need here. We probably need to go to another level of detail above and beyond that. So we think there's some energy data extensions that we would be looking to make to define a metadata standard that works for us. The key point here, though, is that it's the agreement between the person requesting the data user in EDTF terms, and the person who owns and holds the data just now. So it makes sure, as I say, that the organizations are talking the same language and starting on the same page. We still got work to do on this metadata standard though, so I think that's one of the next steps that we need to move on to, and we are having some initial conversations about what that might look like. If you could move on a slide, please, Vivian. So that was the left-hand side of the diagram, if you like. I've now skipped over right to the right-hand side of the diagram, and we're at the point where the data has been assessed by the network organizations who are looking at providing the data, and this is how we see the exit from the data triage process working. So this is just a replication of what's in the EDTF guidance, a recognition that there are 5 standard issue areas that are the potential for a problem to be to come in, and red, amber, green kind of terminology against those. We don't know yet whether that will be red, amber, green, or whether there's some other kind of assessment against that, but there certainly would need to be some recognition of each of those 5 different areas and an assessment as to what the risks would be, and also then what the level of access would be. So again, the 4 different levels that have been defined as part of the EDTF guidance are what we're proposing to use there. So an example on the screen here, I'm showing that we've been through the assessment. We've identified there are no risks in any of the issue areas with sharing the data, so this information could be made available in an open format. You can see just down at the bottom in the grey part of the diagram there that the published metadata section has also got the justification about the level of access. So not just saying, yes, we're going to provide this data as a open or public or whatever level, but actually describing why that is the case. And also if we've applied any mitigation techniques, making sure those are captured, and the rationale for why mitigation has been applied is also included. If you could move on a slide for me, please, Vivian. So right in the top left of that diagram, there was a box which you certainly couldn't read until I expanded it on this screen here. And this is a mechanism that we are developing for how to help guide a request for data. So if we assume we're in a world where some data is already being published, the information that's available now is already out there, and an organization comes along and asks for some more data from us, we want to guide that request as much as possible to help the requester and the network organization responding to that request to ask for as much information as possible. So down the left-hand side of this, you can see there's a kind of categories of data for defining who the requester is, including the organization that they're working for, the type of organization. We need a title for the request, so we've got something to hang our hat on, if you like. And then there's quite a bit of detail in there about what a request, how to describe a data request, including acknowledging that there might be a need to recognize what the minimum viable product data request would look like, because not all data will be captured and available just now. So whilst the ideal solution might be to have, I don't know, network monitoring at 5-minute intervals provided for all of the feeders right down at the lowest level of granularity of our network, that's the ideal situation. That doesn't exist just now. So what's the fallback position that might be acceptable, that still makes sense for this particular requester? Down the right hand side of this, you'll see some kind of green drop down things. So we're thinking that as much as possible we want to provide assistance to fill in the request template. So none of this would be mandatory. This is all just guidance to try and help the request be as targeted and as appropriate as possible. And within that, then we would provide drop downs to give the sorts of information that we think might be appropriate for the requester to ask. So I'm not going to go through the detail of what's in the request description. I'm conscious I'm needing to move on a little bit. And down the bottom, the bottom 2 rows of this table, use case. Now we've identified that in some circumstances it may be appropriate to understand the use case. Not in all circumstances, but if, for example, there is information that might help us understand what the requester is intending to do with that data, that might help us make sure that we provide the right data to facilitate that request. And in circumstances where there's a cost associated with capturing and delivering the data, we may want to understand what's the customer benefit at the back end of this process, so that we can offset, we can make sure that the costs are appropriate to the benefit that's going to be achieved by working through providing that data. Okay, thank you, Vivian. If you could move on another slide. So this diagram, so those are some of the features of this diagram, but it does have quite a few other elements on it, which I thought were worthwhile just recognizing. Firstly, I talked at the outset about proactive approaches to publishing data. So we're not saying that we're just going to sit back and wait for data requests to come in before we publish any data. The intention is that this same process could be used internally by ourselves, and we could move our own data sets through these data processes and work out what the right thing to publish is. We've also recognized that when each member organization, each network organization receives a request, then it's appropriate for us to consider, is that request specific to our data? Is it broader? Could it be other electricity network organizations? Could it be appropriate there as well? I mean, even if it's a request for information for data that's come from Glasgow City Council, for an example, then is there a reason why another city council might not also be interested in that data, and we should be broadening that request out further? But also, is it appropriate to consider it across sector as well? Is there some elements of the data request that might be appropriate to consider from a gas perspective, or vice versa? So we're looking within the process. We've applied a mechanism to think about broadening out the request and making sure that we're publishing the most information that we can. You'll see that kind of metadata little icon thing as the second box down on the left hand side. The intention there is that we would publish metadata early, so even if we're still a little way away from undertaking the triage process and eventually publishing some data, that doesn't prevent us from actually publishing the metadata and describing data sets early, so that there is that visibility for the industry to understand what data exists. I did mention about having a governance of an organisation to have some form of oversight of this process, and the membership of that is something that we'll need to think about. We envisage there would be network company representation on it, and probably ENA, but it may be appropriate in some circumstances. We've talked about understanding the benefit to customers and acknowledging the cost to the network companies of providing the data. That kind of gets more into a regulatory space as to, well, does it make sense for funding money to be spent in that area? So we recognise this governance organisation has got quite a broad remit. And I think if you could move on to the final slide for me, please, Vivian, thank you. So that was a quick walk through the high-level process. We're still interested, we're certainly interested in feedback from this session as to what people think of that approach. It does take a bit of time possibly to have a think about it, so I'm sure we'd be more than happy to receive comments back after the session as well. I mentioned, I think the metadata standard is a key thing for us to move on next, so we certainly need to be thinking about what that's going to look like. We'd like to trial the high-level process as well. We think that can be done in combination with some of the work that Matt is about to talk about on the Digital System Map Group. So I think that would be a useful mechanism to do that. That high-level diagram, we have started thinking about the level that sits underneath that, more on the lines of what a process diagram might traditionally look like. we need to develop those at the next level. We'll do that as part of trialing the process and understanding what works and what doesn't, and getting stakeholder feedback on this as well. There's been some conversations already about other activities happening elsewhere. This all needs to fit into that context, so we need to keep an eye on other activities. We need to have a look at the organizational structures that are impacted by this, both within each network company. So, for example, having data landing pages, I think, is probably something that we would all want to move towards relatively quickly, and maybe that request template could be something or other that could be pushed out relatively quickly, and provide a mechanism for stakeholders to engage with us. And then in all of this, we're keen to start quickly and to get things up and running, and to learn the lessons, and to feed those back into our processes. So we'll be looking to get things out there and look to implement a mechanism for continuous improvement. Thank you. That's all I have to present on just now, and I look forward to feedback and any questions that people have.
Okay, Steve, thank you. Thank you for that really informative presentation. It has actually prompted one or two questions on Slido, Steve. So
Okay.
if you're on Slido, maybe have a look at those and we can discuss them during the session.
Will do.
So yeah, as I say, a few interesting and very useful questions in there. So thank you to those who've posted those questions. I will now move on to Matt Webb of UK Power Networks, who's Head of Asset Information. Matt's going to present to you the work being done thus far on the digital system map. So go ahead, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Vivian, could you move on to the first slide, please? Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully most of you are already aware of the work we've been doing on the National Energy System map, and have seen some of the work we've been doing over recent months to move this forwards. The slide that you have in front of you here is, first of all, just a quick reminder of the recommendation from the Energy Data Taskforce with respect to an energy system map, and specifically what we're looking to address. The reality is, as with a lot of what we're working on, it's no small undertaking, and effectively we're working through a number of phases as illustrated on the slide here, and making good progress. So we have a dedicated sub-working group as part of the ENA Data Working Group that's focused on this particular deliverable. We previously delivered some energy system map demonstrators, which I'll talk a bit more in a moment. Undertaking stakeholder engagement off the back of that, really to understand the target use cases and aspirations of the end stakeholder community and what they want and need from this type of solution. And we're now at the stage where we are about to commence the development of a scale proof of concept before, ideally, as long as that's successful, moving to full-scale implementation of an enduring solution. So in terms of what we are, aiming to achieve, first and foremost, it's about through the POC, that is, it's about trying to prove that we can successfully create a integrated national level energy system map, both gas and electricity, distribution and transmission, pulling those varied data sets in disparate formats together, presenting them in a standardized way, giving a single integrated, highly usable tool that services a whole range of use cases and stakeholder communities. The key thing is with the POC, we want to be ambitious, but we also need to make sure that it is successful and we don't overstretch ourselves. So as well as proving the platform, proving the steps that we need to go through in delivering, as much as anything, it's about demonstrating a lot of the elements and capabilities that we talk about in the broader context around EDTF, the metadata standards, data triage process, so on and so forth. All of these things lead to us being able to surface this data via the platform. It's really just the tip of the iceberg. And again, I'll talk about that in a bit more detail shortly. So the key thing is the final paragraph on the slide here is a key set of outputs and outcomes you want from the POC itself is to understand what are the potential obstacles that we may encounter in implementing this, and especially moving to scale at the national level. What are the key enablers? What does an enduring system look like? What does the long-term or immediate capital and long-term operational investments look like, and how do we maintain it? So there's an awful lot we want and need to learn off the back of it. So as much as anything, the POC is about learning those lessons, filling those gaps, proving that we can bring the data together, not necessarily catering for a huge number of use cases and getting too clever too quickly in terms of the functionality it provides. There's a huge amount of value that can and will be realised just by servicing the data in this way. And over time, we will then incrementally layer and build functionality, use case services, and tooling on top of that. If you could move on to the next slide, please, Vivian. Thank you. So just a very brief reminder of the demos that we published earlier in the year. So 2 demonstrations that we provided. The first, in the screenshot at the top left, is just a very simple view of that, is something called the ENA platform, which is an Australian platform, which is very much aligned to what it is we want to achieve in the UK. And effectively what we did within the demonstrator is just showcase some of the functionality and use cases that they have within that tool. The guys behind that very kindly worked with us to put together what they call a data story, which I walked through. And ultimately it's there to show what we aspire to achieve and the art of the possible. The image on the bottom right hand side here is a piece that Steve, who was just talking, led on. And this was working with Esri and was very much aligned to what we're doing with the Scale POC. But for the Scottish network operators, they pulled together their data and serviced it on the Esri platform. And the image you can see there is the output of that work. So there was minimal functionality within that. It was very much a case of showing that we can and are able to integrate and surface that data in this way. But basically, if you haven't seen these, we published a video which gives a walkthrough of both of these demos. The link is on the slide there. So when these are published, please, if you haven't already seen it, do take the time to follow that link, take a look. It will give you some insight into the early steps we've taken and the direction of travel and what we aspire to achieve in line with Australia, hopefully catching up and ideally surpassing what they have there in the months and years to come. So next slide, please, Vivian. Thank you. So just to emphasize the previous point I made and something that's been touched upon a couple of times as we've presented this afternoon, in delivering the energy system map, it needs to be recognized that the visual interface and the use cases it serves is really the tip of the iceberg. The bit that you don't see below the waterline is everything that we need to consider in terms of the broader Energy Data Taskforce recommendations. So I won't talk around all of these, but I think they speak for themselves. Stakeholder engagement is obviously key. We need to make sure that we are servicing the broad stakeholder community, but that is vast, and the number of use cases that we could potentially service is virtually endless. So it's about how do we build functionality that meets and satisfies as many stakeholders and many use cases as possible. Then we come to the technical aspects. We obviously need to have a clear specification for the platform and the functionality that it's able to afford. There's the data definition specification steps. We've spoken about the data catalog. We've spoken about triage, so on and so forth. All of these activities need to be undertaken to some extent in delivering energy system map. So what it gives us, as well as in terms of delivering the POC, testing the technology, integrating the data, servicing it, and giving a usable tool, it also allows us to provide a test bed to a lot of these other work streams and activities and deliverables that we've got coming through. So data triage is a great example of what Steve was just talked through, is something that we can apply and test in anger in delivering the data sets that we want to surface via the energy system map. So as I say, this is even for the POC, it's a big undertaking and a real concerted effort, but there are various benefits we will deliver through this particular piece of work. And then again, just moving on, please, Vivian. Thank you. And the final slide. So in terms of the what we're targeting through the POC and the specific use cases. So as I mentioned before, we have engaged with stakeholders. We received feedback following the demos, and obviously there's been an ongoing dialogue around that. And ultimately, when you look at the use cases that have been spoken about and general requirements in terms of what people want and need to see, they can be boiled down into the 7 headings you see across the top there. People want to know what assets are out there, where they're located, who owns them, generally their capacity, the level of utilization of those assets, their performance, and opportunities. And when I talk about opportunities, it's opportunities to connect for flexibility. Looking at the commercial space, there's a number of things that fit there, but ultimately there are a number of variations around those themes. So that's what we've considered in terms of scoping out the potential use cases for the POC. And I do use the word proposed at the stage because we are very, very near to finalising, but we just want to do a final sort of sanity check on these. And if people have any particular views on what we drafted, then please do push it through to us before we do sort of get the ball rolling with the actual delivery of the POC. So the use cases that we've outlined here, start with the first one here, is UK-wide visualization of above and below ground energy distribution transmission network assets. So really simply, we will show our key circuit and site assets and their location with key attribution. And although that sounds very simplistic, the fact is that that will deliver against a number of potential use cases. So the 4 sub bullet points I've got there, it will help facilitate planning, design and feasibility assessment across a range of stakeholders. It helps inform asset protection and risk management, i.e. where are their corresponding assets and how does that interact with other third-party infrastructure, environmental factors and so on. It helps facilitate multi-agency coordination. And there's the potential to include the development of local area energy plans, i.e. local authorities, and helping inform their activities and planning. And that's just 4 of many, many others. But it's a good demonstration of how just by satisfying some fairly simple elements in terms of what, where and who, forgetting about any of the more sort of complex and technical aspects, you can satisfy a lot of the use cases that we've been asked to look at. Moving on to the second there, geospatial representation of supplier primary bulk grid supply areas. This is, instead of looking at specific assets, this is looking at what is the area of supply from a given circuit, substation, bulk supply point, and so on. So again, it helps inform those opportunity aspects, and that's where we can start to pull in potentially capacity and utilization elements. The third is around integration of third-party open data sets. So clearly, there's a lot of value to be had from us just surfacing our data. There's even more value to be had by being able to integrate that and visually represent it alongside other third-party data sets. So you can see we've mentioned there about environmental factors such as flood, fire, vegetation is another one. If we can facilitate the simple import of other data sets, whether they are openly available data sets from other agencies, or even your own data sets as individual stakeholders. Clearly, there's a whole range of potential use cases that can be facilitated there that provide broad benefits and value. And then finally, visualization of third-party connected distribution energy resources. So this is where we recognise that there's the element of the EDTF recommendations around asset registration, and there's been the ongoing work on the system-wide resource register, for example. DCP 350 is connected to that. They are tabular outputs, reports, data sets. It makes sense for us to look at that and things like the methane sites on the gas side, which allow us to show these third-party resources that are connected to our network, their location, their interactivity with their assets, and so on. So again, slightly discrete, but quite simple use case for us to hopefully fulfill and demonstrate. So they're the use cases that we're targeting, and hopefully you can see how that fits into the broad headings along the top. So in terms of where we are in the process, as I mentioned before, we are close to publishing or kicking off the tender process for the POC, because we do need that partner to help us deliver. the data activities and provide the platform which we provide this on. We are very much near the back end of the preparation activities for that. We will be going to market shortly. We'll run through that commercial process and ultimately aim to kick off the development and delivery activity through the remainder of the back end of this year, and definitely landing the full POC, which is at national level, so all gas and electricity network operators ideally across the UK on one single platform, will be done in 2021. So, that's everything I want to cover. Hopefully that's given some good insight into where we are, and look forward to answer your questions should you have any later on.
Okay, Matt, thank you for another very comprehensive presentation. I should have said between both Steve and Matt's presentation that there was a poll available on Slido on whether you agree with the process undertaken on data triage. Could I please encourage you all who are on Slido to complete that poll, and then once we do so, we will move on to a similar poll for the digital system map. So we'll maybe give another couple of minutes on that poll before we move on. But thank you for everyone in their interaction on that poll thus far. You may have seen on the chat on the webinar itself that we have had quite a significant number of questions through Slido, which is excellent. We've had over 30 from what I can see. Clearly, in the 20 minutes or so that we have remaining, we won't get through all of those. I do apologise for that. I will take and pick the questions based on the number of likes that they've had. So if you do like a question, feel free to hit the like button, and we will go through the questions on that basis. As I said a little earlier, we will be publishing responses to all questions that have been asked. So please don't be too disappointed if your question isn't answered specifically during the next 20 minutes or so. But do keep the questions coming. They're incredibly useful, very informative, and will help us greatly in how we respond and work with you and develop the activities that we're working through as a data working group. So with that in mind, I'll ask the first question, and I'll pass it on to yourself, Matt, if you don't mind, which came from Neil Meredith. That is, what do you see as the role of the IEC Common Information Model, or SIM for short, in terms of exchanging data and in defining metadata?
Yeah, thanks, Graham. So I think SIM is going to play an increasingly important part as we move forwards. So you're probably aware that the wider activities of the ENA are looking at the role of SIM, and Randolph might be able to come in shortly to sort of build on that. But there's a clear direction and recognition that SIM is a sensible standard for us to adopt across the electricity industry to inform standardization and interoperability. As individual network operators, I think we are all largely working with SIM to a greater or lesser extent already. They tend to be against specific projects and capabilities rather than wholesale SIM network modeling, and I think that's the step we need to take. But I certainly see it as an important component of this larger landscape, and will play a part in a lot of the deliverables that we're looking at. I mean, we spoke before about APIs and microservices, about the vehicle for exchanging data. The standardization of the format of the data that you're transferring is even more important, in my opinion, and SIM certainly is clearly the key tool for that from the electricity industry point of view. Randolph, I don't know if you want to add to that in terms of the activities that's going on with the ENA in that respect.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Just a quick one. Within the Open Networks project specifically, we're discussing how SIM can be used for data transfer between networks, particularly between T&D. And there's a sort of feeling that it's definitely one of the better options and one of the most comprehensive from an electricity networks perspective. But obviously within the data working group, we need to discuss whether that makes sense from a gas side as well, and whether there's something that we can create that's common across all the networks.
Okay, Matt, Randolph, thank you for that, and hopefully, Neil, that helps in response to your question. Matt, if you don't mind, I might ask yourself Dan Klein's question, which is, when errors are found in the data and the energy system of the map, what workflow is being tested with the DNOs to ensure feedback loop to improve processes? Perhaps Steve could help you with that too.
Yeah, so it's certainly something that's been discussed. The reality is it's not something we are looking at building within the POC. As I said before, we want to make sure that we're not overreaching in the POC and setting ourselves up to fail, because there's a lot of moving parts and components that we need to deliver. So success of the POC will be around the ability for us to pull together the data from the significant number of network operators that we have, standardize that, surface it in a normalized manner, and satisfy those handful of use cases. As we move into production scale, that's absolutely where we want to consider those sorts of tools and mechanisms, and giving people the opportunity to highlight issues, errors, even opportunity or suggestions for improvement. And in reality, that can be serviced pretty easily. And within the requirements that we've outlined in terms of the functionality of this type of tool, that's something we've factored in there. But just to manage expectations, don't expect to see that as a component of the POC.
I'll just agree with what Matt's saying there. I think there is a wider point as well about just generally about this data sharing should be a bi-directional process. We expect to be able to bring data into our organizations as well as pushing it out the way, and that data and insight needs to be brought back in, and we need to think about how do we react to that and work in this kind of wider context. So yeah, I think there is a good point, Dan, and an interesting one for us to think about.
Okay, Dan, thank you for the question, and Matt and Steve for your responses. I'll just pause there a little second. I think we've probably taken the poll on the data triage process as far as it will go. So Vivian, if you don't mind, could you open up the poll for the digital system map, please? Okay, we'll go back to the Q&A. So the next question, Steve, I'll point at yourself if you don't mind, which is Dublin Core doesn't guarantee that all metadata have the same format or are interoperable. Do you have any plans to publish a standardised form of sharing data?
So I think metadata needs to be a focus for us, and we'll be having some conversations internally around the ENA about the data working group about what our next steps are with metadata. You're absolutely right; it doesn't guarantee interoperability, and that is a key feature of the Energy Data Taskforce recommendations. This also needs to sit in the context of other activity that's going on. The Modernising Energy Data Access competition is looking at mechanisms to be able to push data out there, and that will have a role in defining what those mechanisms are to ensure interoperability. I don't think we've got the answers at this stage yet, but it is something which is on our agenda and is on our to-do list to look at.
Okay, and if there are any views, Steve, from the the individual who asked this question, then feel free to share them with you. Yeah.
Of course, yes. As much feedback as possible is all appreciated.
Okay, and I guess that applies for all questions, so feel free to do that. Randolph, I'm going to pass the next question to you, if you don't mind. How do we balance the need for mapping the UK energy system against the ENI security?
Thanks, Graham. Yeah, good question. For those of you who don't know, CNI is critical national infrastructure, which obviously our members would be counted as. So this is a tricky question, and there's different thoughts on what level of security needs to be provided in terms of data and how much you can make available, how granular you can make it, which fields you make available and what you don't. It depends what camp you're in, whether you're in the sort of data camp or the security camp, I think a bit, but we're working with our cybersecurity and general security colleagues to discuss these sorts of topics. I think, you know, when you're thinking about this sort of thing, you've got to take a bit of a practical view to it as well. You know, for example, a lot of the assets that we're talking about, you can actually just go on to Google Earth and turn the satellite images on. And so we're trying to take a practical approach, but also work with our security colleagues to determine what should and shouldn't be made available. And the data triage process will very much help with that as well.
Okay, Randolph, thank you. I guess I would add to that the triage process, of course, we'll cover that off. But equally, we're learning from others, aren't we? You know, we're looking at other, you know, large-scale projects that are equally of critical national infrastructure, and we're trying to learn from them through that data triage process. So we're not just trying to do this and consider this in isolation. We are looking at others, and we will continue to do that across all our work streams. So an excellent question, and one that very much at the forefront of our minds. So thank you for that. The next most popular question is a SIM-related question. I will pass on that one on the basis we've already responded to a SIM-related question, but we will answer that in due course. I will therefore move on to Tony's question, which is about how can we give input to both static and dynamic data sets? Will any of this data be made available through the Electrolink Flexa beta platform? So Matt, would you mind answering this one?
Yeah, sure. So for those that aren't aware, Electrolink Flexa is a project outside of the scope of ENA, and its objective is to provide a single platform for the electrical distribution network operators to facilitate data sharing and flexibility related services, amongst others. It's in its early phases. There's a Pathfinder phase about to kick off, and it's also going through the innovation process in terms of funding under NIC. So in terms of the data sets that will fall within that, when you look at the scope and ambition and value proposition of the project, it's ambitious. You know, it's quite expansive in what it's promising in terms of the data sets that could be pushed out, both static and dynamic. The specifics around that have not yet been bottomed out. So I think the key thing to recognise is the fact that Flexa is not going to be a Pandora's box where you can have access to absolutely everything. It will be subject to the data triage processes applied by the respective network operators. So we ourselves, working collaboratively through that project, similarly to what we are doing within the ENA, need to review what data sets we have, apply those triage processes, understand the applications and implications and what controls we may need to put around them in terms of who can access them, how they can be used, and so on. And Flexa will certainly seen as being a vehicle, a platform for which we can service them and make them open to the wider stakeholder community. As I say, the specifics of what those data sets will be is yet subject to confirmation.
Okay, Matt, thank you. I'll move on a couple of questions, if you don't mind, to a question that I found, which I thought was quite interesting, which was from Rajesh. So I'll ask yourself, Steve, if you don't mind. So are there any plans to learn, sorry, I've just lost it. Are there any plans to learn from similar initiatives that have happened in other industries, i.e. open banking standards or the RTS data model for the retail industry? Not necessarily specific to those, but it's certainly something that's on our radar, isn't it?
It is, yes. We have been speaking to people who have been involved in those initiatives. We're certainly keen to learn the lessons from there and to see the journey that they went on. I think open banking in particular is an interesting area that is worthy of spending a bit more time looking at. So, yep, I think that is something that we will be wanting to take forward and spend more time looking at those areas and see what we can learn from them.
Okay, Stephen, just quickly, a couple from Tony on API. So one is on the vetting process and the other is whether we would allow, if you like, third-party results to be fed back into the systems. I guess a security question. Maybe you want to just touch on both.
Okay, on the vetting process for users of data, I think we wouldn't be explicitly vetting users. I don't think intention behind the presumed open approach is that data should be made available to whoever needs to use it. There are different levels of access though, so there may be data sets where we do want to understand who's using the data, at least have a record of who's got access to that data, and possibly even providing sort of limited usage or legal agreements in place around for some of the data sets, depending on exactly what the requirements are. So that maybe is something we do need to have a look at. I think the bidirectional did talk about this needing having the ability to bring insight back into our organisations is important to us. I think we need to be careful about any direct connection through, you know, as you mentioned, Graham, the security side of things. I think the questionnaire also recognises it as well, and we would need to be conscious of that. But we want to live in this new world of open data and open information that we can share. So there is a need for us to think about how we would be able to exchange information both directions.
Okay, thank you, Steve. I'm just very conscious that time is marching on, and that we want to cover off the next step. So I'll maybe just pick up a couple of interesting questions myself, just very briefly in the last couple of minutes. So there was a question specifically on I've lost it again, apologies, on network communications and the capability to interact with the network more than we have at the minute. Absolutely a precursor and an enabler for digitalisation, not least in the context of decarbonisation and net zero, but there is undoubtedly significant need to better or have better visibility and interaction with the system at a lower voltage than what we're capable of as network companies and gas for that matter today. So that is a key enabler, as somebody points out. There's also a couple of questions on the provision of data and to what extent do we take data within the data working group or as network companies. I think there's a key point in here that's worthwhile sharing, and again, welcome feedback on this, but there has to be a point where we service the data needs of stakeholders and the use cases that they request. I think there is a real risk that we surface data that isn't necessarily of value and ultimately just increases costs to consumers. So there is undoubtedly an obligation on all of us here to ensure that we keep the cost of this and the benefits associated to the lowest cost possible to the consumer and maximise the benefits available. So I think we are all of a view that we will surface data that is needed to manage the use cases that are brought forward, rather than just simply making all data available, because it could be quite costly to do so with limited or if any benefit associated with that. But we will welcome feedback and interaction from you stakeholders and how that evolves over time. So as I said, many questions, incredibly useful for us. We will spend some time over the course of the next week or so reviewing those questions and providing you with feedback on each of those questions. We have also now closed the poll on the digital system map and just opened a new poll, which is how useful have you found this webinar? So we would really appreciate your feedback and thoughts on that. There's a final poll which will follow in a minute or so. But before and whilst we do that, I think it's important just to set out next steps. So this is the first of a number of webinars that we intend to run as a data working group over the coming months. We would welcome your feedback on what we think or what you think they should be, what you would like to see from them. Did this meet your requirements or not? And we will continue to do that over the course of the next few months. We will also, as I said, leave the Slido poll and the Slido question and answer open for the next day or so. And once that closes tomorrow, we will then look to respond to those questions and provide the answers to each of those questions over the course of the next week. We, however, are not a closed working group. We are always open and we're always looking for your feedback and interaction. So feel free to get in touch with us. There's many ways in which you can do that, not least us as individuals, but the ENA itself and the group itself. So yeah, please do. Stakeholders are absolutely critical to this, both in terms of how we develop it as well as how we shape the activities that we're undertaking. Okay, so we have the final poll open now for the next couple of minutes. We would like to see and hear from you in terms of what topics would you like to see presented at future webinar sessions, so feel free to suggest some ideas. I would like to provide an extensive thanks and gratitude to Vivian for providing the facilities and hosting the slides and providing presenting an excellent way of working through the presentation. Randolph, Gabby, Matt and Steve for excellent presentations and contributions to the question and answer sessions. I do hope you have found today's webinar very useful. We do look forward to hearing from you further. Do interact with us and we will provide you with responses to the questions that you've asked. So thank you very much for today's webinar. I do appreciate your interaction and I will look forward to speaking to you all soon. Thank you.